Dear students, in today's video tutorial, let's continue from where we had left off the text of The Sound Machine by Roald Dahl, which we were doing in our previous English literature class. So please take out your textbooks and please follow the text as I go on reading and explaining from time to time. And I hope you are able to relate with the lines from your textbook, because as I told you, I don't have access to the textbook, and that's the reason why I have downloaded the text from the net and I am using that in this PDF which I am explaining. But the text is supposed to be the same, the lines are supposed to be the same, and so if you just follow your textbook side by side, it will be easier for you to understand which area of the text we are doing right now. So we had just left off at the point when the doctor suddenly remembered that he has to go and see some of his patients who are waiting for him. Dr. Scott leaves Klausner and goes away, and we know that Klausner is considered to be eccentric. He is a mad scientist, as his neighbors think of him. And now let's see what Klausner is up to. He is inside his garden shed, inside the room where he has this 3 feet long black box, which is like a child's coffin and which is actually a sound machine or a device which he has invented, by means of which he can hear ultrasonic sound vibrations or the sounds which are not normally audible to the human ear. So once the doctor leaves, let's see how Klausner reacts, what he exactly does. So on your screen you have the next paragraph beginning. For a while longer, Klausner fussed about with the wires in the black box. Then he straightened up and in a soft, excited whisper said, "Now we'll try again. We'll take it out into the garden this time, and then perhaps the reception will be better. Lift it up now, carefully. Oh my God, it's heavy." So this heaviness of the box proves that the device made by Klausner is actually a heavy device, and he is picking it up. He carried the box to the door, found that he couldn't open the door without putting it down, carried it back, put it on the bench, opened the door, and then carried it with some difficulty into the garden. He placed the box carefully on a small wooden table that stood on the lawn. So what is Klausner trying to do now? He's trying to put the machine outside in his garden, in front of his house, and then he is going to tune into this machine and put on the headphones, and then he's going to try and listen to the various sounds of nature which otherwise are not audible. So let's see what he does. He returned to the shed and fetched a pair of earphones. He plugged the wire connections from the earphones into the machine, just like you do in case of your earphones when you attach them to your mobile handset. The same way he attaches them, and then he's all set to listen. Now all he has to do is turn on the machine and adjust the knobs, and the pointers and the dials would get him to the right frequency of the different sounds that are going on around him. So let's see what he does. And the movements of his hands were quick and precise. He was excited and breathed loudly and quickly through his mouth. Why do you think he was breathing heavily? Because of excitement. So he was breathing out of excitement. He was panting, in fact. And he kept on talking to himself with little words of comfort and encouragement, as though he were afraid. Afraid that the machine might not work, and afraid also of what might happen if it did. So he had fear both ways. If the machine does not work, what then? Then he'll be a failure. Then he'll have to again do something more with his experiments before he can develop a perfect machine to listen to such sounds. And on the other hand, if the machine functions properly, then what might he possibly be able to hear? So the very thought of that, the unknown sounds which he would probably be able to hear for the first time ever by any human being, that is, was making him excited and also at the same time scared. So this is what is being described here. Now he He stood there in the garden beside the wooden table, so pale, small, and thin that he looked like an ancient, consumptive, bespectacled child. So, this was the way he looked. He looked pale in the face, he looked small, he was actually a thin man, and then he looked almost like a child who is wearing specs. The sun had gone down, there was no wind, no sound at all. From where he stood, he could see over a low fence into the next garden, and there was a woman walking down the garden with a flower basket on her arm. Now, the neighbor, the lady who lives in the neighborhood, just adjacent to his house, is another compound which belongs to his neighbor, and this lady has come out with a basket into the garden, into her garden, and he can see her over the fence, over the hedge of his own garden. So he is watching her. Don't think that Klausner is interested in women. He's probably looking for a scope to listen to some sort of sound. He watched her for a while without thinking about her at all. So that is what it means, that he's not interested actually in the lady. He's just watching her to see what she is up to, and whether she tries to do something which could possibly help him to listen to some sort of sound with his device. So he was watching her. Then he turned to the box on the table and pressed a switch on its front. That must be the switch which turns the machine on. So he turns it on. He put his left hand on the volume control and his right hand on the knob that moved the needle across a large central dial, like the wavelength dial of a radio. The dial was marked with many numbers in a series of bands, just like a radio dial, you could say, only that it had a needle pointer, and there were different frequencies shown on the dial, and it was in the center. It was big. The dial was big, and then there was this needle or a pointer which moved along the dial as he turned the knob. So it was just like the wavelength dial of a radio, and so there were many bands in it, starting at 15,000 and going up to 100. It is in fact what do you call this? It's one with 6 zeros after it, so whatever it's called. So you can just imagine that the dial had so many frequencies mentioned or marked on it. And now he was bending forward over the machine. His head was cocked to one side in a tense, listening attitude. So he was trying to listen. Now the lady had come out into the garden with a flower basket. Obviously, she was going to pluck some flowers, and Klausner wanted to listen to the sound produced when the flowers were plucked or cut off from the plant or the plants. So he was bending forward and his head was leaning on one side, and he was trying to listen, just like one would do when one was trying hard to listen to some faint sound. So his head was cocked on one side, he was trying to listen. His right hand was beginning to turn the knob. The needle was traveling slowly across the dial, so slowly he could hardly see it move. And in the earphones, he could hear a faint, spasmodic crackling. Spasmodic, which comes and goes, something which comes and goes in a rhythmic manner, is spasmodic. He was listening to the crackling sound as you normally hear when you try to tune into some kind of radio station by turning the knob of your radio. So you hear the sound of the static, and you also get to hear the sound of some kind of crackling. The same kind of sound could be heard coming from this machine. In fact, the machine was not making the sound, the machine was only receiving the sound, and Klausner was able to hear this sound in his earphones or his headphones. Behind this crackling sound, he could hear a distant humming tone, which was the noise of the machine itself. But that was all. As he listened, he became conscious of a curious sensation, a feeling that his ears were stretching out away from his head, that each ear was connected to his head by a thin, stiff wire like a tentacle. It was not really happening. Klausner was just imagining. It was seeming like that. It's not really happening that way though. And that the wires were lengthening, that the ears were going up and up towards a secret and forbidden territory, a dangerous ultrasonic region where ears had never been before and had no right to be. The little needle crept slowly across the dial, and suddenly he heard a shriek. What's a shriek? A scream. A frightful, piercing shriek. And he jumped and dropped his hands, catching hold of the edge of the table. He stared around him as if expecting to see the person who had shrieked. There was no one in sight except the woman in the garden next door, and it was certainly not she. She was bending down, cutting yellow roses and putting them in her basket. Again it came, a throatless, inhuman shriek, sharp and short, very clear and cold. What was happening? This woman, this lady across the garden, this neighbor, she was actually with a pair of scissors, she was snipping or cutting yellow roses. She had come out with a flower basket in her hand. Maybe she was collecting the flowers to take them inside the house, inside her house, and decorate her house, maybe put them in a flower vase or something. So that is what she was busy doing. She was bending over the rose bushes, and she was with a pair of scissors. Why scissors? Why wasn't she plucking them off? Because rose bushes have thorns, and the stalks are actually quite hard, and so rosewood is one of the hardest wood that you can possibly find. So that's the reason why she was using a pair of scissors to cut the stalks of these flowers, and also to enable that all the stalks are cut properly, so that all the stalks are of the same length, and then she would carry them in her flower basket and go inside the house. So she was busy cutting the flowers, and each time she was cutting a flower from its stalk, there was this screaming sound which Klausner could hear through his earphones by means of his sound machine. So she was bending down, cutting yellow roses and putting them in her basket. Again it came, a throatless, inhuman shriek, sharp and short, very clear and cold. The note itself possessed a minor, metallic quality that he had never heard before. Klausner looked around him, searching instinctively for the source of the noise. The woman next door was the only living thing in sight. He saw her reach down, take a rose stem in the fingers of one hand, and snip the stem with a pair of scissors. Again he heard the scream. It came at the exact moment when the rose stem was cut. At this point, the woman straightened up. She had already cut enough roses. Just as Klausner had seen her cut the last rose, she stood up, and now she was ready to go back inside her house. So Klausner wanted to be sure whether he had heard it right, whether it was indeed the rose bush or the rose plant which had been making this shrieking noise each time the flower was cut. He wanted to be more sanguine or sure about it. And so in the meantime, this lady, she put the scissors in the basket with the roses and turned to walk away. Mrs. Saunders! Mrs. Saunders! Well, the lady's name is Mrs. Saunders. So we are introduced to the name of this lady also now. So this is the third character in this short story that we are introduced to. And he's calling out to her, Mrs. Saunders! Klausner shouted, his voice shrill with excitement. Oh, Mrs. Saunders! And looking round, the woman saw her neighbor standing on his lawn, a fantastic arm waving little person with a pair of earphones on his head. So, what did she see? This man, her neighbor, standing in his lawn, in his garden, across the hedge, across the fence, waving at her. He's wearing a headphone over his head and he's waving frantically at her to draw her attention. Calling to her in a voice so high and loud that she became alarmed. Cut another one. Please cut another one quickly. So Klausner is requesting her to cut one more flower. She stood still, staring at him. Why, Mr. Klausner? She said. What's the matter? Please do as I ask, he said. Cut just one more rose. So she is a bit puzzled. She's asking and he's asking her to cut one more rose. Mrs. Saunders had always believed her neighbor to be a rather peculiar person. Now it seemed that he had gone completely crazy. She wondered whether she should run into the house and fetch her husband. No, she thought, no, he is harmless. I'll just humor him. So she said, Certainly, Mr. Klausner, if you like, she said. She took her scissors from her basket, bent down. Now, what is this lady thinking? Why would a neighbor stand with wearing his headphones, stand there in his lawn and request her to cut one more flower from her flower garden? What could possibly be the reason behind it? Just one more. Why? She's wondering. So she's right if she thinks that Klausner has gone completely mad. Anyway, just to please him, she cuts one more flower. She bent down and snipped another rose. Again Klausner heard that frightful, throatless shriek in the earphones. Again it came at the exact moment the rose stem was cut. He took off the earphones and ran to the fence that separated the two gardens. All right, he said, that's enough. No more, please. No more. The woman stood there, a yellow rose in one hand, clippers in the other. Clippers? The scissors in the other with which she had clipped the rose. So she was standing there looking at him. I'm going to tell you something, Mrs. Saunders, he said, looking at him. She's looking at him and he says, I want to tell you something. Now this madman wants to say something more. The lady is wondering. So, something that you won't believe. He put his hands on the top of the fence and peered at her intently through the thick spectacles. You have this evening cut a basket full of roses. You have, with a sharp pair of scissors, cut through the stems of living things. And each rose that you cut screamed in the most terrible way. Did you know that, Mrs. Saunders? No, she said. I certainly didn't know that. It happens to be true, he said. He was breathing rather rapidly, but he was trying to control his excitement. I heard them shrieking. Each time you cut one, I heard the cry of pain. A very high-pitched sound, approximately 132,000 vibrations a second. You couldn't possibly have heard it yourself, but I heard it. So Klausner is trying to explain what he had heard. Klausner is trying to be very explicit. He's trying to describe, but he forgets one thing at this point, that what he has invented and what he is able to describe could possibly be all Greek or absolutely difficult to understand for an ordinary person who is not an inventor like him. So Mrs. Saunders may not be able to understand what he is trying to say. And besides, it will sound so absurd if somebody says that the rose was screaming in pain, and that is exactly what is happening here. Did you really, Mr. Klausner? She decided she would make a dash for the house in about 5 seconds. Why? Because she was now 100% sure that her neighbor, Mr. Klausner, had gone absolutely mad. You might say, he went on, that a rose bush has no nervous system to feel with, no throat to cry with. You would be right. It hasn't. Not like ours, anyway. But how do you know, Mrs. Saunders? And here he leaned far over the fence and spoke in a fierce whisper. How do you know that a rose bush doesn't feel as much pain when someone cuts its stem in two as you would feel if someone cut your wrist off with a garden shears? How do you know that? It's alive, isn't it? Yes, Mr. Klausner. Oh, yes, and good night. She said this, and quickly she turned and ran up the garden to her house. Klausner went back to the table. He put on the earphones and stood for a while listening. He could still hear the faint crackling sound and the humming noise of the machine, but nothing more. He bent down and took hold of a small white daisy growing on the lawn. He took it between thumb and forefinger and slowly pulled it upward and sideways until the stem broke. From the moment that he started pulling to the moment when the stem broke, he distinctly heard in the earphones a faint, high pitched cry, curiously inanimate. He took another daisy and did it again. What is a daisy? It's a flower which grows automatically most of the time in Britain. And he did it again. Once more he heard the cry, but he wasn't sure now that it expressed pain. No, it wasn't pain. It was surprise, or was it? It didn't really express any of the feelings or emotions known to a human being. It was just a cry, a neutral, stony cry, a single, emotionless note expressing nothing. It had been the same with the roses. So, this is how the author describes the sound that Klausner heard through his headphones when he tried to pluck one daisy after another. So, he had been wrong in calling it a cry of pain. A flower probably didn't feel pain. It felt something else, which we didn't know about. Something called tom or spun or plinacment or anything you like. So you can look up these words in the dictionary or in the Google dictionary. So he stood up and removed the earphones. It was getting dark and he could see pricks of light shining in the windows of the houses all around him. So he decides to call it a day. He wants to test his machine again the next day. So the lights were already coming on from the different houses in the neighborhood. Carefully, he picked up the black box from the table, carried it into the shed, and put it on the workbench. Then he went out, locked the door behind him, and walked up to the house. So we'll stop here for the day. Walked up to the house. That's where we stop. And we will continue once again in the third and the last video tutorial and finish this story. So in the first part of the story, we have seen how Klausner has built a machine, how Dr. Scott is inquisitive about it, how Klausner explains in detail how this machine can capture high frequency sounds or ultrasonic sound waves, and by means of his earphones he can listen to those sounds which human beings have never heard before. And the doctor, being a scientific man, Klausner confides to him. The doctor does not know really what to believe and suddenly makes an excuse and goes away because he has other patients to attend to. So maybe the doctor does not believe him, wants to get away from him, thinks of him as someone who has gone absolutely crazy. Then the second part of the story, we are introduced to one more character. We have seen Mrs. Saunders, the neighbor. She comes out into the garden to pluck flowers. She has yellow roses blooming in her garden. So she has a pair of scissors in her hand and she cuts those flowers one by one. She is carrying a flower basket too. And Klausner listens to her actions by means of his machine. He can hear the shriek of each rose when it is cut, and so he tries to explain it to her, but she thinks of him as a madman and makes an excuse and goes back to her house. Now, the third part of the story is what we are going to see in our next video, where we shall see what exactly is done by Klausner the next morning. So, with that, signing off. Thank you very much.